Welcome back to the MedTech Snapshot, the one question, one answer, highly digest medical device podcast. Through these next 3 episodes that you'll be watching, Brad Maruca, Managing Director of Deloitte's MedTech Division, shares with us some really interesting topics having to do first and foremost with our OEMs and industry partners potentially making the wrong decision and strategy as it relates to how they focus on building their organizations and looking first at addressable markets and clinical outcomes. We also dovetail into episode number 2 on looking at bias and data bias, and for the fact that at the very end of the year, patient procedures and demand seems to uptick every single year. And why are we not talking about that a little bit more within the industry to build better strategies? And last but not least, Brad seems to be able to weave in an interesting story having to do with the bull weevil in his career. So stay tuned. Welcome back to MedTech Snapshot. With me today is Brad Maruca. I'm really excited to dive into this detail, but first, Brad, why don't we have you introduce yourself?
Sure. Travis, thanks for having me on. My name is Brad Maruca. I'm a managing director at Deloitte. Been here coming up on 4 years, August. Prior to that, I was in MedTech, so 26 years in MedTech. I spent 19 of those years in neuromodulation.
You know, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, because you have a unique background where you came from industry, doing 25, 26 years, whatever, what have you, and then have transitioned into the dark side with me here on the consulting front. So your perspective playing on both sides of the fence, I think, is unique. Yeah. You know, and that kind of dovetails into our first discussion here, which is from a strategy perspective, especially when we look at startups that are looking to get maybe their first pop, looking to scale, commercialize. You have a really interesting perspective on that. It certainly got my attention when we were talking prior, which is, you know, do they have the strategy wrong? Right? And your comment, I don't want to steal your thunder here, but was, you know, is looking at the addressable market and clinical outcomes first, is that the wrong strategy? So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that most of the time, if you ask a MedTech client what their commercial strategy is, they don't have an answer, or they have an answer that says, well, this is our compensation plan, and so everybody knows what we need to focus on, or they'll give me a tagline, you know, win in blah, blah, blah. You fill in the blank, some sort of therapeutic area. And so I think the starting point is that most people don't have a well-articulated commercial strategy, partially because so much of MedTech decentralizes strategy down to the territory manager level. So they have products, they have programs, they have offering, they have culture and guidelines, but ultimately they're paying their reps such high remuneration because the expectation is they'll convert those things or reconcile those things into a regionally or territory-based strategy of their own. And to me, it's a little bit lazy, to say the least, right? But you are trying to attract people that are very entrepreneurial in nature, and you're trying to get them to reconcile all the nuances of the different markets into a strategy that's effective, and that's been the way that most people operate. But regarding the total addressable market, like everybody in MedTech's seen the deck, right? Like slide 3 is this gigantic circle, this global addressable market at $40 billion, growing at 10% CAGR, and then you hop to slide 4, which is, hey, I'm capturing 1%, which sounds modest. But of course, it's a huge number. That's what they're going for. Like, hey, if I just got 1%, look at how much it is. But sadly,
and by the way, every deck has that same exact approach.
Deck. But sadly, it's arbitrary and it's mostly fiction, right? Because this is where the TAM approach first kind of fails, is that the competition compression is invisible in TAM math. You know, when a market is genuinely large, like chronic low back pain, where I came from, AFib, type 2 diabetes, you know, pharma's already there. You know, they're treating these patients often with first-line guideline support. And then you have the AHRQ, which is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. It's like a federal agency, you know, within the Department of Health and Human Services. Like, they have clinical society guidelines that create de facto Q for devices. So a device only gets considered after the pharmacological failure. And that Q can be 3 to 5 years. Actually, going back to one of my low back pain studies, the average time to spinal cord stimulation was 11 to 13 years, right? And so 3 to 7 years is actually quick to get to a device therapy. But then we have like the 510K paradox, right? Which is like it's demonstrating substantial equivalent to a predicate device. So by definition, the regulators aren't evaluating differentiation. They're only evaluating safety and how closely it approximates something that's already on market. And this, of course, is where the conflict is. Whoever it is that's pitching this deck with the TAM, if they're saying it's substantial equivalent, what they want to say to the market, what they say to regulators is it's equivalent. What they want to say to the market is how different it is, right?
Correct.
So this is the point of tension. So the companies pursue this 510K path. They're trying to get to a premium commercial position as fast as they can. But the data shows like 80% of device approvals go through the 510K. So there's like this tension on these investor decks that nobody addresses. And they're usually, since they're using something already on market, are constrained by whatever the current reimbursement already is. They're not generating their own data to generate their new CPT code to make sure they're pricing to value. Instead, they're pricing to cost and the existing reimbursement. So then they have this whole thing with this reimbursement cliff, right? Like, let's say they're lucky enough to get like coding and coverage or a new technology add-on payment, which if they get a new CPT code, it can take 5 years post-clearance, right? And so it's like the device will not end up making its way onto it won't get adopted, right? The clinical data will sit in a journal and the device will sit in a warehouse. Right? So that's what ends up happening. So like my push nowadays is like not to think about a serialization of activities. So from clinical evidence to reimbursement pathway to commercial incentive, those should be in a potato sack race together. They should be feeding off one another. It should be connected. The way that you're going to commercialize should inform how you structure your clinical evidence, and you should have an idea about, hey, can I price to value based on the health economic value, and will I be patient enough and create evidence compelling enough to generate the codes in order to do that? Now, one thing I'll say, and this is the last piece because I think you and I have talked about this privately, and that's the physician side, right? Like, so on the company side, we're not benevolent. We're a for-profit business in most cases, and sometimes the expectation is if I don't have these things in line, that the physicians are going to behave in a benevolent way. You only have to be in medtech for a week to realize that that's not true. And so if you look at like the RVUs, like this relative value unit, this is usually a function of time and complexity. And so in procedural specialties, they're incentivized by volume and reimbursement efficiency, not purely by clinical outcomes. So making a pure clinical outcome case is a failed thesis from the start. So if you have a new device that adds 45 minutes to a procedure and reimburses identical to a faster incumbent, you're going to have a near zero adoption rate. Right?
Well, and that's also why you see situations where, especially on the new tech horizon, it may be better than what's out on the market, but it doesn't get adopted either because A, it takes money out of the physician's pocket.
Yeah.
I love my physicians, by the way. I'm not trying to beat up on them.
Likewise, Travis, likewise.
Or B, trying to get that new adoption for new technology is such a huge hurdle. It's just easier to stay with what's on the market that everybody's using to begin with.
And you said an operative word in there, Travis, which is it's better. Well, who's making the case that it's better, right? Is it better intuitively, or is it better substantiated by compelling head-to-head evidence? Like we're very, in MedTech, I'm going to say we, the collective we in MedTech, orient ourselves usually versus conventional medical management. Well, for one, there's usually pharmacological interventions that are not conventional. They're more advanced pharmacological treatments. And second, that's a pretty low bar, and it drives down our sample size. So when we have to do a pivotal trial, we compare it towards a comparator that has a very low effect size. So then we end up with a large effect size by comparison, and so our sample sizes are low and our superiority claims are meaningful. But is that the decision the physician is making? Are they really considering conventional medical management, or are they considering an alternative device, alternative procedure, or more advanced pharmacological? So this is really, really important for us to think about things in terms of opportunity cost and what is the real clinical decision that's going to be made by the patient, by the payer, by the practitioner at the point at which this device is commercialized. And if you haven't engineered that into your clinical study, all you're doing is checking the box with regulators, but you're going to fail. You're just going to fail later, right? If it doesn't get reimbursed. And so that's my push really with a lot of clients.